Okay, so back to topic 11. We were talking about cancer, okay? And I'm trying to remember which things we talked about. We definitely talked about red meat and we talked about processed meat. So don't remember, there's one thing I may have said or not said about processed meat, which is going to come up in the next lecture. But when they say processed meats, usually they mean things that have nitrites and nitrates in them. So we're talking about lunch meats, hot dogs, bacon, those kind of things. One thing that I may have mentioned or not have mentioned is that you're starting to see advertised a lot of these things that are, I think that, they're usually using the word natural or natural nitrites and things like that. And pretty much a nitrite is a nitrite, whether you get it from a natural source or you get it from another source. And probably you're not changing your risk if you're eating natural lunch meats, whatever that means. I believe there's a lot of misconceptions and dishonesty from the food industry when they're saying those kind of things. But I know there's something around that coming up. The other thing I was going to say is that the data is clear for high consumers only. For people who eat these things moderately, it's not clear whether you are increasing your cancer risk. Now, what is high consumer? If you have a hot dog every day, I would say that's probably a high consumer. Because there definitely have been studies that show people who eat hot dogs daily have increased risks. Anyway, just something to think about. Exactly where that how much is too much threshold is really the big question. Definitely high users are the people at risk. So a few other things about cancer. Fiber and fluid. Both of those things are good for you. Probably you know that. Exactly what's going on. There's lots of studies that show people who are kind of chronically dehydrated for some reason have an increased cancer risk. I'm not sure what kind of cancers. It could be colon cancer. Definitely higher intake of fiber decreases colon cancer risk. And I don't think we exactly understand the mechanism of it. Probably it is that the fiber is scooping things up. So, we have toxins and whatnot that are going to be going through our digestive system, and the fiber will absorb them, and they're not contacting your cells as frequently. But I'm not sure if that's just kind of one of those we don't really know. And so we think this might be going on. I think the textbook has a kind of a paragraph on it, and it sounds very speculative if you read it, for sure. Folate and other vitamins. Some cancers are associated with certain vitamin deficiencies, folate being one of them. But the big one I want to talk about today is alcohol. This is one of these things that a lot of people do not realize, is that alcohol is associated with several types of human cancers. I think this is 7. There's at least a couple of more types of cancers that we think there might be an association with alcohol consumption. And again, this is something that is definitely clear. Like, this is a type 1 carcinogen, meaning that we have very good data in animals and humans on this. But again, it's the high users, people who are consuming much more than the suggested amount. The moderate user, some people are suggesting there might be a decreased cancer risk. But so anyway, it's the high users. Exactly how much is too much is kind of the question, right? As always with all these things. So this one here actually has 1, 2, 3, that has 9 types of cancer on there. The ones with the stars beside it are the ones where the strongest links are known for sure. So we're talking about throat and esophagus is one of them. So esophageal, mouth. So those are areas that are definitely getting contact with alcohol. Breast cancer. As we talked about last day, breast cancer has a huge list of risk factors ranging from genetics to what time you hit puberty, to the amount of fat you have on your body, to alcohol consumption, to use of oral contraceptives, and the list goes on. But there is a strong correlation between breast cancer and, again, high alcohol consumption in there. And it's probably something hormonal, as I've mentioned before, around breast cancers. Colorectal, again, going through the digestive system. How exactly it does this, there's a lot of different ideas in how this does this. I think I actually have a slide on this. One of the things that alcohol has is a byproduct, alcohol consumption. So alcohol is, it's a chemical. It will dissolve your membranes. It's in hand sanitizer, right? And it's technically a toxin, but our body is very good at basically breaking it down, right? And going through that breaking down process, assuming you drink it in moderation or slowly, your body will break it down and it's gone, right? But one of the intermediates in this is a thing called acetaldehyde. So acetaldehyde is way more toxic than ethanol. And it will do all sorts of things to you. For example, it will give you a headache. And that's the least of your worries. So if you ever had, you know, some people like to drink red wine. I enjoy red wine. Some are not born equal. Some red wines are great and you're fine. Another red wine, you have a glass and you have this nasty headache for one glass of red wine, right? And it's because of the fermentation process. Sometimes, you know, the yeast is doing an intermediate going on here, making this acetaldehyde. So the acetaldehyde is actually a known carcinogen, whereas the ethanol is kind of, like I said, it's sort of that's the intermediate when we're breaking alcohol down. So this is the kind of thing that we're concerned about, right? And it's damaging your DNA, and that's leading to cancer. There's other reasons why ethanol may lead to cancer as well, especially, like I said, in high consumption. And another reason why you shouldn't be drinking on an empty stomach is alcohol interacts with membranes really well, and it can actually help other toxins to pass through from your gut into your body. So it's kind of like a solvent, right? And so it's bringing things in, and that may actually be part of the reason why it's contributing to colorectal cancers. And another thing alcohol is very good at doing is messing around with your hormones, and that leads to, like I said, probably has the link with breast cancer. Anyway, so just yet another reason why in many things we should think about moderation, of course. I found these nice infographics from the UK Cancer Society, or whatever they're called, and they're showing the amount of cancer risk, right? And you can see on the left, they're looking at mouth cancer, on the right is breast cancer. And they're showing you that, for example, the one on the left with the mouth cancer, and so this is probably per 1,000 people in the UK, so probably very similar in Canada. For people who do not consume alcohol, there would be about 5 cases of mouth cancer. Okay, so it's not the only risk for mouth cancer. And people who are having 10.5 units of alcohol a week, so apparently a bottle of beer is 1.5 units. So that's maybe, I don't know, about six beers a week. You're looking at 1 extra case. So the amount of risk is not like way through the roof, like something such as consuming tobacco products. But the risk is there. And you can see that the risk goes higher and higher, actually quite dramatically, with people who are chronic and heavy users. You can see 44 units. So I don't know what that is. How many beer a week? 30 beer or something like that. The cases are more than doubling, the tripling, and so on, right? So definitely there's a very strong correlation between the heavy users, the moderate users. It's kind of mild, right? And you can see breast cancer, same thing here. You know, as the number of cases or the consumption is going up, we're increasing the number of cases. And this is just statistics, right? In terms of looking at what is going on. Anyway, like I said, I find stats very interesting, particularly with these kind of things around public health. So just going back to this here, I showed you this. We were talking about, I can't even remember what topic this was, 3 or 4, about the alcohol consumption guidelines. And so we talked about that a little bit here. And this is the recommendations that men limit themselves to 10 per week, or sorry, women 10 per week and men 15 per week, and not drinking every day and all that. And this is one of the areas where these guidelines have come from, right? They're looking at chronic diseases, cancer being one of them, and where the risk starts to go higher. So there's some debates around this kind of thing. If you look at the guidelines from country to country in different organizations, and sometimes I think this is quite a bit to be consuming on a regular basis. But again, these are the recommendations based on chronic diseases. And you can see all the other things it's talking about. I'm not going to go through all this all over again, but like I said, just kind of relating that to cancer. And the other thing we're going to talk about 2 units from now, we want to talk about mother and child. And hopefully everybody knows this. If you're pregnant or planning on being pregnant, you should avoid alcohol entirely. So we'll come back to that. Okay, so what about other things? A bunch of different things are related to cancers, right? You can see high cancer intake or high calcium intake related to cancer, linked to prevention of different types of cancers. High iron intake associated with certain types of cancers and so on. And so it's all about just getting a good balance. There's a couple other things I want to talk about. One of them I want to talk about is acrylamide. I don't know if anyone's been following the news the last couple of years, what's going on in California. Anyone know what I'm talking about? I don't know if I mentioned this already, but in California right now, there's a bunch of, I'm not sure where it's at in terms of the lawsuits and all those kind of things, but California is a pretty kind of strict government in terms of environmental and health safety laws. I'm not criticizing them for that, but acrylamide is I think it's category 2A or 2B carcinogen. So it's a possible human carcinogen, meaning that they have studies done in animals that show that in high doses, animals get cancer from it. But not humans, not good data in humans. So they're like, this is a possible human carcinogen. What products have acrylamide in it? Well, it turns out pretty much anything that has a grilled carbohydrate in it. So picture it, you're talking about toast and coffee and potato chips. And I mean, what does not have a grilled carbohydrate in it? So suddenly the lawmakers in California decided we are going to have to get McDonald's and Starbucks and everybody to put a cancer warning on all their coffee. Right? Isn't that fun, right? To be, like, now imagine the food distributors, obviously extremely upset about this. So this is about 5 years ago, and my understanding is it's kind of still in the courts, and I have no idea where it was. Last I heard they were dropping it, and now I heard it's still in the courts. I haven't checked the news in a while regarding this, but I know it pops up once in a while around the controversy of this kind of thing. So like I said, what is acrylamide? It's a chemical. It's made from grilling carbohydrates. My understanding is the highest risk things are potatoes, certain varieties of potatoes. So French fries and potato chips and coffees. But the good news is, as far as my understanding of the data, most people do not consume anywhere near enough to put themselves in an increased cancer risk. I found this little infographic here. It's talking about in terms of where we're looking at, where's the, doesn't say it. Okay, so it says here the maximum daily intake is maybe about 195 micrograms before your cancer risk goes up. And you can see they're showing how much acrylamide is found in toast and potato chips and whatnot. And so, you'd have to be eating at least, 10 bags of potato chips before you're even close to getting to that risk. And of course, it doesn't say how much coffee. I'm sure some of us, I know a guy who was telling me he was working in a warehouse and drinking 15 to 17 cups of coffee a day. I imagine that can't be healthy for you no matter what, right? And he was cutting down and then roll up the rim to win season came along, and then he was in trouble again, right? So this is not the end of the story with chronic disease. There are many, many chronic diseases out there. A lot of autoimmune diseases are kind of under the radar in the last few years. There's a lot more awareness around them. And it turns out many of these things are connected to diet in terms of you can help the symptoms with diet. The obvious ones are the digestive diseases, celiac disease, and those kind of things. But kidney disease is related to diet, and autism. Symptoms of autism can be controlled to a small degree, at least, and in some children to a higher degree by giving them a good diet. So there's lots of interest there. Something a lot of people don't realize is that there's probably more immune cells in your gut than there are almost anywhere else in your body. And autism is an autoimmune disease. And so there's some relation there, right, in terms of what's going on in your gut and your diet and your immune system and all that. And we're kind of, at a very early stage of really understanding what on earth is going on there. Was there anything else I was going to say? Yeah, so how do we protect against disease? All the usual recommendations, right? Fiber, moderation of saturated fats, moderation of sugars, going for the good things, right? Making sure you have lots of good nutrients such as calcium, having those omega fats, those kind of things. There's been some focus on things like potassium, for certain diseases. Again, that's high blood pressure, right? And potassium's found in fruits and vegetables. If you're eating the fruits and vegetables, you're probably not getting as much sodium and all those kind of things. So whether it's the potassium or just getting all the extra fruits and vegetables is the question that I'd have. But anyway, like I said, most of the usual recommendations that you're going to see everywhere about nutrition. Okay, so there we go. That was topic, whatever that was, 11. Okay. Anyway, so quiz 11 we'll be doing next Wednesday. We're on Wednesday, right? And that's it for that for now. Okay, so topic number 12 is on food safety, and we're going to talk a little bit about biotechnology and genetically modified organisms. And this unit here is kind of one of these ones that there's about 1,000 things we can in theory talk about. So take a look at the textbook, for example. It's got this massive section on food additives. And can't spend the time going through every single food additive on the planet. That will take us an entire semester. You had our assignment 1 was on food additives. Touched base on a few of them, but most of them we're not really going to talk about, for example. So we're going to focus on a few things anyway. And some of the things that I'm interested in and some of the things I think are important anyway. So let's talk about food safety. Food safety is very important for starters. And we have actually multiple organizations in Canada from the government level that are out there to look out for our safety and health. So when it comes to food, we've got Health Canada. That's probably an obvious one. Health Canada is involved in all sorts of different things relating diseases, whether they're infectious diseases or chronic diseases and so on. Another big organization is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So they inspect meat factories and things like that. And they have regulations around what bacteria are acceptable to have and not have, for example, in ground meat and those kind of things. And if you think about the entire food chain, there's several other levels that are involved in the food industry. Agriculture Canada, for example, is a big one, where they're looking at what the farmers are doing, and several levels before the food goes from the farm and ends up on our dinner plate. And those involve multiple agencies of the government. Not going to go into all the responsibilities, but like I said, the good news is we take food safety very important in Canada as a very a priority thing. And we're actually pretty good at it. In terms of food safety, Canada is possibly one of the highest, one of the best nations in the world. If you look at just even in the little details, things like allergen labeling in foods. We have very strict allergen labeling rules in Canada, and a lot of countries may not necessarily have that kind of thing, for example. So one of the biggest things, and maybe the most serious thing to worry about, is something we call foodborne illness. Foodborne illness basically means people are getting sick from eating food that has some sort of germ or pathogen in it or on it, right? And generally, there's two things that could be said about this. One, we're talking about fecal contamination. So that could be animal or human feces getting into the food. Number two, we're talking about gastrointestinal symptoms for the most part. So vomiting and diarrhea or both, or that and a bunch of other things, right? So some of these pathogens could induce fever, some of them can induce other things and so on. So we're going to talk about some of the pathogens. The textbook has a very long list. It's kind of an interesting list to look at from a pathogen standpoint. Pathogens are something I know a lot about. And I feel like they're missing some on the list. And then others, like they have trichinella on the list, right? There hasn't been a case of trichinella in Canada since like the 1980s, right? I think there's been a few exceptions of people eating wild boars and pigs and things like that. So it's something I'm not even going to talk about. It's not even worth it to talk about trichinella. Government Canada estimates maybe 4 million cases a year. Most cases are not diagnosed, right? People get sick, you're growing up, you have diarrhea, you stay home, and hopefully it gets better. In many cases, it does after a day or two. And that's kind of the end of the story. You don't know what you ate or where you got it from. And a lot of these illnesses aren't necessarily spread by food. Like I said, we're talking about fecal contamination. So it could be drinking water, right? Maybe you drunk the wrong water on a camping trip, or you went to Mexico or something like that. Or in some of these cases, norovirus is very, very, very common. And that virus is like super infectious, right? So you could have somebody here could have norovirus and we would all get sick, and then we would all cause like 10 other people to get sick each, and there could be 200 cases within 48 hours. That's how crazy norovirus is. And it's just because the sick person touched the door over there, right? It's just one of those things that's super infectious and contagious. Where are we getting these things from? All sorts of foods. I'll talk about that in a bit here in terms of what we're looking at, but nobody is immune, whether you're vegan or vegetarian. It could be in anything. It might just mean different pathogens, right? You can see here's a little chart I found. It's talking about leafy greens as being a big risk, but of course meat and dairy products can also be big risks, which is why we have all sorts of things going on in Canada to try to protect our foods. And we'll talk about some of those things as well. So in terms of the top 5, I was looking up this list, and the top 5 in Canada have remained these top 5 for years. But interestingly, the top 5 in the US are slightly different. I can't remember what the differences are there, but I thought that was kind of interesting. So notice norovirus is up there, number 1. This is the one that we have no idea how many cases. This thing will rip through daycares and hospitals and schools like crazy. And most healthy people, they're sick for about 24-ish to 48 hours. And that's kind of the end of the story. And so, you know, they have no idea what the actual numbers are. Norovirus, notice, is the only virus on this list. I'm going to talk about some of these organisms in some details here. The other 4 are bacteria, by the way. And I'm not going to get into a big biology lesson on the differences between bacteria and viruses, but come visit me in my office. I'll talk your head off about that if you want, and get into those details. But the others are bacteria. And all of these here are due to fecal contamination, animal or human feces, is what we're looking at here. And all of these things here could also be what we call waterborne infection as well. Some of these things tend to be a little bit more waterborne, some tend to be a little bit more on food. A lot of them are kind of both, which is also, like I said, with the textbook, I found the list kind of interesting because they seem to really want to focus on some of the waterborne infections, which are actually a lot less common in Canada because we have very good drinking water treatment in most places in Canada. See, there's a question or comment there. Let's see what it is. Okay, so Keisha's just saying when the pandemic began, Canada made it so that wheat gluten did not have to be labeled on an allergen list. It was noted that they did this to take away stress from producers so they could get food up fast. I did not know that. That's interesting. There's certainly risk of food shortages and whatnot. I mean, and again, that's one of those interesting things where trying to figure out how to balance different competing interests, I suppose. I think it's odd that they would do that, but anyway, I guess I only know so much about the food industry. So let's talk about some of these infections. I want to kind of get in some of them in some detail. And I'm just kind of dividing the 3 categories: bacteria, viruses, and parasites. And for various reasons. Now, if you take a look at the textbook, it has kind of this table, but way more detail. And what I want to do is just focus on kind of a handful, about 6 in particular, right? So the 5 on that list, obviously, and a couple of others that I want to talk about as well. Others we could talk about, you can ask me questions about them, but like I said, I kind of want to just focus on certain things that are either more common or have the distinction of being mentioned for certain reasons, okay? And that's where I want to get into. For example, botulism is number 1 on the list. And I'll get to that one in a second. So in terms of the bacteria, the 3 that are most common, and notice E. coli is not on here. I'm going to get to E. coli in a minute. It's kind of its own special category for various reasons. But these 3 here, Listeria, Campylobacter, and Salmonella, generally associated with a slightly different profile of foods. But often one of the common things is something that has not been properly cooked in some cases. So it could be beef, it could be poultry. Salmonella is more commonly associated with poultry, by the way. So that's why there's the chicken and the egg there. Sometimes it's found in raw eggs, so they tell you not to eat raw cookie dough. I think the chances of it being there are something like 1 in 10,000, and I will never stop eating raw cookie dough because it is just amazingly delicious. But there is the risk, so I'm not advocating for it. I'm just saying that I have a flaw. Question?
Do you know if that comes from like the yolk itself or like the egg white?
Yeah, it's on the outside.
Oh, on like.
It's on the outside, yeah. So
Okay.
salmonella is associated with, what's that?
I said just wash your eggs when you bring them home before you make your cookie dough. And then
You could, and there's some debate around that. I'll get to that in a second, but it's basically salmonella is associated with basically chicken feces and bird feces. It's actually found on lizards and reptiles as well. So if you have a pet turtle or snake or something like that, wash your hands afterwards. But so associated with the meat and the egg, right? And so believe it or not, in Canada, we actually wash the eggs. And in Europe, they don't. They basically scrape off any mud and stuff, and that's what they do. And they actually have less cases of salmonella poisoning in Europe than they do in Canada and the US. So weird, right? But it turns out there's biological reasons for that in terms of there are actually protective enzymes and things like that on the outer layer of the egg that we do wash off when we wash our eggs. So there's debate about what we should do, and the Europeans are horrified what we do, and we're horrified what they do. I don't know if you've ever seen chickens and their eggs in a coop. My parents used to have chickens, and sometimes it's horrifying the conditions those eggs are in. But I've never been to an egg factory, so I don't know exactly how all that works, but always interesting there. So salmonella is a big one, by the way. May not necessarily be the most common. I can't remember what the numbers are looking at, but lots of people have salmonella. Often when we get it, people talk about having food poisoning, which is kind of I try not to use that word because it's a little bit vague in terms of what you mean. And I'll get to that in a minute. But a couple other things to comment on. You can see Campylobacter, raw meat, and a big one is associated with is unpasteurized milk. Now you have to try hard to get unpasteurized milk products in Canada, but some people do it. For example, maybe you have a dairy farm. And I've met one person in my life who is a dairy farmer, and she could not rave how much it was wonderful to get the milk directly from the cow and drink it there on the farm that day, right? Question? Comment?
We have a cabin in Wandering River and our neighbor has cows. Should we stop drinking the milk from those cows?
Right. Well, there is a
What's
risk,
the percentage?
and it's reasonably high. Again, it kind of, probably depends on what's going on with the farm and how clean that's kept and all those kind of things. But it's one of those things when they started pasteurizing milk, the amount of illness where that started to happen plummeted. The risks are higher for anybody who's immunocompromised or young children and those kind of things. But it does happen. And there are certain types of cheeses that people can import from. We don't do a lot of weird cheese making in Canada. We're pretty boring with our cheese consumption. For the most part, there are places you can get it, but certain cheeses use unpasteurized milk. So it's more associated with imported cheeses, although we're getting to the point where Canadians are making more interesting cheeses, but for the most part, that's a lower risk in Canada, except for the imported stuff. Certain countries, I think, have, they would never dare pasteurize their milk to make these type of cheeses, for example, right? So anyway, Campylobacter, right? Listeria, the other one on there. Also raw meats, but sometimes it ends up on vegetables. There's a huge cantaloupe recall a few years ago. Again, it's just feces, often animal feces, right? Because of farms, and we're using animal feces to fertilize things, and typically things that are low on the ground, right? They might actually be in the fertilizer, and then sometimes the bacteria get into the tissues, and in some cases, the tissues of the plant will actually grow over the bacteria, so you can't wash it and get rid of it, right? I know, that's horrifying, right? So certain plants, sprouts, for example, are famous for having bacteria in them because they do that naturally. They grow around bacteria. If there's any one food I'd cut out of my diet because of foodborne illness, I would say sprouts, for sure, right? I would avoid sprouts. That's kind of one of the number one things out there. It's more E. coli than anything, but all these things here. One more thing to say about Listeria. It's maybe the most famous to be involved around lunch meat recalls. And the thing about Listeria is, so most of these organisms, they like to grow at, room temperature, warm, incubating type temperatures. Listeria is very good at growing at fridge temperatures. So that's where the lunch meat connection comes in. If there's contaminated lunch meat, it has a chance to kind of just grow in the fridge or the grocery store or whatever. And if you look up listeria recalls, it's kind of a weird thing because you see all sorts of weird products. There was some sort of pre-made macaroni and cheese product a couple of years ago that was in the news. Like I said, cantaloupes, but lunch meats are kind of one of the big ones. So all of these, you're looking at usually gastrointestinal kind of illnesses, except for listeria, because it can get into the blood. And listeria is very, very serious for people who are immunocompromised, or if you don't have an immune system yet, for example, if you're a fetus. So it's a huge danger to pregnant women. So in some cases, you see recommendations that pregnant women avoid lunch meat entirely. I've seen that recommendation at least once or twice. But anyway, we'll talk about listeria a little bit when we talk about mother and child. But you can see, like I said, mostly gastrointestinal illness, although listeria can get into the blood and cause other things like fever and whatnot. So usually healthy people are not the issue. It's the vulnerable that are getting very sick and can cause deaths. That cantaloupe recall, I'm trying to remember where it was. It was like, maybe it was South Carolina or something like that. But I think there were like 23 deaths from it, right? So it was a pretty big deal. Okay, let's talk about E. coli, okay? I have very strong feelings about E. coli. Being a microbiologist, E. coli is mostly good. E. coli is in your gut, it's making vitamin K, it's natural, does not make us sick. But the problem with E. coli is there are many types of E. coli. And the one if you type in, news E. coli and you hear about E. coli infections, this is the one that you're hearing about. And a lot of biologists would say this is not even E. coli because it is genetically, it's massively different in some ways, but it's still classified as E. coli. So this is called hemorrhagic E. coli, or E. coli 0157 as the most common type of hemorrhagic E. coli. And hemorrhagic means bleeding. So this is the one that can cause you bloody diarrhea from it. And it's most strongly associated with ground meat. So where does the ground meat come from? It comes from cows. How does it get into the ground meat? It comes from cow feces. And there's lots of crazy studies done from this. So since the year 2000, the amount of data on E. coli 157 has skyrocketed because of some certain outbreaks. There's one study I was reading where they went to some farms somewhere in Ontario. I think it was near Chatham, and they tested 1,000 cows, and half of the cows had it. Half of the cows, right? And it turns out it doesn't seem to be making the cows sick. So here's another case where you have cow feces and it can contaminate things. And so we've changed our slaughterhouse practices in Canada in terms of around, the way you're allowed to clean it, rather than just spraying with a hose everywhere. There's newer systems to, I don't know exactly what they all are, but apparently there's been a lot of laws that have ramped that up and that has decreased the number of cases and so on. Kind of the just number one thing to say is please cook your ground meat, right? Okay, do not eat undercooked ground meat. That's kind of one of the big things we can do.
If a cow has E. coli, can you cure it, or will that meat always have E. coli?
I don't know if that's been tried. Good question, right? I mean, you can't get rid of E. coli. Question is, can you change the strain profile? Because if you are a warm-blooded animal, whether you're a bird or a mammal, you have E. coli, right? But there's many, like I said, there's many different versions of it. That's the problem. And this is the one that is the most nasty because it can cause this bloody diarrhea. And again, if you are elderly or very young or immunocompromised, it can lead to kidney infection and death, right? And that's what we don't want. And like I said, it can be very, very serious. Did you have your hand up?
Is this bacteria or virus?
This is a bacteria. E. coli is a bacteria. So it's associated with cow feces. And again, this is something that we're using as fertilizer. And so this is why once in a while, there was about 3 years ago, there was a massive romaine lettuce recall. And you couldn't find romaine lettuce for the longest time, right? And of course, suddenly I'm craving Caesar salads all the time for some reason because you can't get it. You always want what you can't have, right? And that was a case where it took them a while to actually figure out the source of the contamination. But it turned out in that case, there was some farming area, wherever the romaine lettuce was from, and there had been some flooding. And so where the cows were, the water went, from the cow area into a neighboring farm, which was this massive area where there was this romaine lettuce. And the lettuce, of course, grows close to the ground and can capture some of the bacteria, all right? So this was kind of a problem. It happens once in a while. You can see there's this joke here about the spinach. Again, it had to do with a spinach recall years ago. So the big risk is the ground meat, but sometimes it ends up on produce due to, you know, weird events and all that. So this is the one when you hear E. coli in the news, this is one you hear about. It's unlikely though that that most people are going to get it. The number of cases in Canada are low, but it does happen once in a while. The biggest thing in the news that's happened, and this is again 20 years ago now, and people are still talking about it, is the Walkerton water tragedy. And this was a crazy, crazy thing that happened. Again, now this is years ago, but it got into the water supply in Walkerton, Ontario. And I can't remember how, I guess it says on there, 1,200 people got sick, right? So that's about a quarter of the town, and had quite a few number of deaths. And this was a case where a flood, again, went from some farmland into the town reservoir. And there's some really sad parts of the story about the people who were doing the water testing were ignoring results and things like that. And they're in jail now. But anyway, since this, there's been the amount of research in Canada around E. coli 157 has gone way up to kind of prevent this thing from ever happening again. So what can we do about bacteria? We can cook our meat. That's one of the #1 things you can do. And if you go traveling, you can be aware of what country you're in terms of what the sanitation processes are, right? You know, if you're going to a place like Mexico, you know, they say don't drink the water, don't brush your teeth with the tap water, those kind of things, because these kind of things can be in the water. And around vegetables and things like that, you know, if you're staying at a resort or something, ask what they're doing with those vegetables and what they're doing to clean them. And, you know, those questions are worthwhile to ask. But cook your meat. That's kind of one of the big things to think about. Let's talk about botulism for a minute. Almost didn't want to talk about botulism, but I always get questions about it. So first of all, I want to point you to this little stat here, the number of botulism cases in Alberta over the last few years. Right, we're looking at maybe 1 case every 2 years. But for some reason, lots of people really freak out about botulism. And the #1 case where this happens is people who are pregnant or have a baby, because you see it in the literature all over the place about do not feed your baby honey, right? So don't do that. I'd rather you didn't. The risk is very low. But sometimes these spores from these bacteria end up in honey. And I think I was reading a study, I think it's like 1, maybe 2% of honey might actually be at risk. And it's very small amounts. So if you have a well-developed immune system, it's so small that you're not even going to have any issues with it. But if you are a baby and you don't have a properly developed immune system, it can be a massive risk. I could not even find numbers on how many cases of infant botulism have happened in Canada in the last 10 years. I couldn't even find those numbers. But botulism overall in Alberta, very, very low. So the #1 risk is to babies. The other risk is canned items. So by canning, I don't necessarily mean things in cans, but it could be things in cans. But some people do canning of fruits and vegetables and things like that. And so I have this picture here of like all these jars. And sometimes it happens, right? I don't know who has done this kind of thing, but generally what you do is you cook the foods to some degree, or you heat it up. And the jars themselves are usually boiled and sterilized, and you put the food in there and you seal it up. And the whole idea is you're sealing it away from air, because air is going to oxidize the food. And the cooking part is going to hopefully kill any bacteria that might have been on that food and whatnot, right? And so depending on what food it is, it could be dramatically cooked or just mildly cooked or whatever, right? And so I'm mentioning the oxygen part because it turns out that this organism that causes botulism doesn't need air. It's anaerobic. So that's where the risk is that you could have gotten rid of everything else, but these bacteria may happen to be in there as well. And so this is why when you have canned food, it's usually good, but once in a while, it might go black, throw that one out. Always worth it to take a sniff when you open these things up, just to make sure that there's nothing in there. But generally, right, use your senses, your eyes and your nose, and you'll probably be in good shape. I don't know if anyone has ever seen this. I remember one time, years ago, being in an old grocery store, and I saw a can of food in that grocery store. I don't remember what it was, but the can was swollen, right? So if you ever see that on your own shelf, don't eat that one. Hopefully it's obvious. Probably when you open that, it's going to be black or something like that. But that's why, canned food also, in theory, it's sterile. but it also has a best before date because eventually the anaerobic organisms can eventually grow. But not going to dwell anymore on botulism. Lots of interesting things about this bacterium. The toxin, by the way, is called the botulinum toxin. If you look that one up, it's the same toxin that is Botox, right? So it's kind of interesting. Something that will kill us in small amounts will make us look nicer, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, lots I could say about Botox, but we won't go there. Okay, so there are many, many more bacteria out there, particularly if you want to go the waterborne illness kind of thing. If you go back to that chart, you'll see there's one that talks about traveler's diarrhea. Traveler's diarrhea is typically a waterborne thing and is a different type of E. coli. But the good news is usually you're talking about, maybe 48 hours of unpleasantness, and it's kind of something that passes in most cases. We'll come back to traveler's diarrhea here in a moment. I want to talk about two viruses and there are others we could kind of throw in there, but these are the two that are kind of come up the most in Canada. Number one is hepatitis A. Not going to get into hepatitis A too much. In Canada, it's pretty rare to get it in Canada. Happens once in a while. There was an asparagus recall. I'm not even sure if that was in Canada now, maybe 5 years ago, that had hepatitis A on it. And there was an onion one I remember reading about. Doesn't really matter. Usually you're more at risk of getting this from traveling as well. All right, so again, not picking on Mexico for any reason in particular, just lots of people go there. And so it's more likely to get these things because more people go to Mexico, not that Mexico is worse, okay, just for the record. So you're talking about undercooked food, right? Again, shellfish for some reason is associated with that, but it could be all sorts of produce or water or things like that it could be associated with. And the one thing to know about hepatitis A is it's different from hepatitis B, which is different from hepatitis C, and I think it goes all the way to H, G, I'm not sure. A, B, and C are the most common ones, all right? And hepatitis B and C are more associated with, like hepatitis C is more associated with intravenous drug use. Hepatitis B is sex and drugs, kind of a little bit more like HIV, and they're different diseases. They're all related in that they infect the liver, so they have the same name, hepatitis, but they're different things, right? And if you get hepatitis A, it's not usually a death sentence. It's something that most adults will clear off in a few days, very, very rarely fatal, and there's a traveler's vaccine for it. So if you are going somewhere, then you can get the shot if you like. The other one I want to talk about is norovirus, and there's so much could be said about norovirus. Number one is you don't want it. Norovirus, sometimes I call it the 2-bucket flu. So just use your imagination for a moment. But it's that one, and we've all had it, whether as a child or whatever. Everybody gets it at some point, and you will get it again and again in your life. And just picture that time, the last time you had some violent vomiting or diarrhea, lasted for maybe a day or two. That was probably norovirus. And it was not fun, but you live to tell the tale. Rarely fatal, but this is the one that closes daycares and schools and nursing homes and cruise ships, and it's super, super infectious. And it just sticks to everything. You don't have to drink contaminated water or eat contaminated food. Somebody with norovirus can just touch the doorknob, and then boom, 10 people have it, right? There's all sorts of interesting stories about norovirus. There's one study I was reading about an airplane. Somebody threw up on an airplane, and within 48 hours, they were able to track, I think it was 230 sick people from that one person, right? By people near them getting sick, and then those people getting other people sick within 48 hours, right? So not much to say about norovirus. You got to clean places, washing hands, all those things are important. Probably none of those things will ever fully prevent it because it is just so nastily infectious. But like I said, the good news is not fatal. I've never heard of a fatal case of norovirus, just very, very nasty. 2 days ago. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so it happens, right? And you don't want it. And so this is the kind of thing when you have a child in daycare and the daycare is closed down. This is probably the reason why. Oh, the other thing to say about norovirus, lots of names. A lot of people call it the stomach flu. I hate that name because the flu means influenza, which is a respiratory virus, right? So I hate the confusion there. I'm seeing a lot more places called the winter vomiting bug. is kind of the number one name for it. It used to be called Norwalk virus, named after a town, but the people of Norwalk, Connecticut didn't like that, so now it's called norovirus. So if you hear any of those names, it's the same organism. I'm not going to get into these parasites. The textbooks seem to want to focus on certain parasites for some reason. They're more or less, there's two things to say about these things. One, some of them are very, very rare in Canada. The other is they're more associated with contaminated drinking water than they are with foods. So if you've ever been in a town or a city with a boil water advisory, sometimes they do that out of precaution. Sometimes they do it because they've actually detected some of these things, cryptosporidium or giardia in the water. Usually you're looking at diarrhea, and if you do get it, this is the one that you may want to get treatment for, right? So traveler's diarrhea, you can see, is on here. So if you get traveler's diarrhea and you're sick and it's more than a few days, it's probably giardia or cryptosporidium, right? So E. coli from traveler's diarrhea may be the most common one, but most people it's like, you know, could be 1 to 5 loose stools kind of thing, right? Giardia, we're talking about a week or two. I'm hoping by that point you're getting medical help. So just do it if it happens, right? Please. But I'm not going to say anything more about those. You can look them up, and there's, like I said, lots could be said about them. So a few other things about food infection to say is that, like I said, people talk about food poisoning, and it's kind of a loose definition of what it is. And when you're looking at in terms of the medical area, sometimes we talk about food infection versus food intoxication. By intoxication, we mean these things actually have toxins in them. So like botulism, that has a toxin in it, and the toxin is what is going to make you sick, and it is a very nasty toxin. Food infection means the organism is actually growing in your body, right? So I'm not too concerned about these definitions, at least for this class, but if you're interested in those particularities, you can certainly look them up. In terms of food intoxication, botulism is pretty rare in Canada, as I mentioned. Staphylococcus is a little bit higher up there, and well, we don't want to get into staphylococcus. We could say way too much about that as well. So I'm going to move on from that. So let's talk a little bit about farm to table, okay? And like I said, there's a ton of things we could talk about here in terms of what's going on in the food industry, but there's a few kind of points to make, right? One is that there's obviously stuff going on at the farm, and it's going to be different based on whether it's a plant or an animal, and whether it's large scale or smaller scale, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Different practices in Canada. We get much of our produce from other countries. Could be California, could be Honduras. You know, so there are different things going on in different countries in terms of practices and those kind of things, right? Which can be better or worse. And then everywhere else in between. You know, the food processing, you know, whether it's a slaughterhouse or a factory that's putting stuff into cans or whatever it might be. There's the grocery store, the restaurant, and whatnot. And the reality is that most of the food poisoning or contamination events happen at the consumer level, right? So, like I said, all of these things are regulated. What you do in your own house, in your own refrigerator, is not. And that's kind of the bottom line, is what's going on there. And so there's a few things that we can kind of think about as we prepare our food and whatnot. We'll get to that in a minute. One of the other things I want to talk about, and we kind of hinted on it with a little bit with milk, and I have a video I'll share with you in a moment, is just want to talk about pasteurization. Okay, so I have this little video I'll share with you about what it is and what it does and why it's important. And this is one of these things, kind of historically, if you look at it, it was a pretty significant health intervention in terms of human history. So I'll play this video for you, and we'll talk about it for a minute. So a couple things to be said about pasteurization. They kind of misrepresented how it's done in the video. Usually it's actually done in a tube, right? How do you heat something up for 15 seconds and then cool it down really quickly? It's actually done in a tube. So the milk is traveling through a tube and it hits a zone in the piping that is hit by the high temperature. But yeah, so this is why, like, this question is why it is that sometimes you see these products, right? Like I've seen these little, well, they're not juice boxes, but chocolate milk boxes, and they're on the shelf, not in the fridge, in the grocery store, right? And that's what they're doing. They're doing that ultra high method. It has longer shelf life on it. But these things still do have best before dates because there could be bacteria that do escape the pasteurization process. The interesting thing about milk products is I have a friend from high school and her family used to own a convenience store. And of course, once things hit that best before date, they take it off the shelf. And she knew exactly how long every product, how long it was good after that best before date. So chocolate milk goes bad on the day of. That's the one thing I learned from that. But yeah, pasteurization, there are a couple of other things we could say about it. Generally, you're looking at heating something for a really short amount of time. And the idea is to hopefully not affect the taste or the nutritional value. There is some debate about that, particularly, do one of those deep dives on the internet. And you talk to cow farmers who want to drink, the milk directly. But it is one of those things that has definitely been a major health innovation. I'll get you 1 second. The other thing I was going to say in Canada, like this is a liquid thing pretty much only. In Canada, not all juices are necessarily pasteurized. And sometimes there are cases where that gets the juice industry in trouble. I haven't heard of anything like that in a while, but that's just one of those little facts that I know from somewhere in the back of my head. Question?
Going back to milk, like Dairyland, for example, how do they have dairy-free milk? Like, how do you just take the milk proteins out?
Is it some sort of alternate milk, like soy milk or something like that, or?
It's just lactose-free. Oh, let's take
Oh, it's lactose free. Yeah. So in that case, in most cases, what they're doing is putting an enzyme in there that they're putting a lactase enzyme. So that's what. So if you are a normal milk drinking person, you have that enzyme in your gut.
Yeah.
So they just put that in the milk directly.
Some things are dairy-free though. Is that the same thing?
I think dairy free means usually soy milk. Would be my guess. Yeah. I mean, there's so many.
Dairy free, that's what they mean, is that it's lactose free.
Yeah. Good question though. I have to look at the labels. Yeah. It's hard to keep track of all the products now too, right? I mean, particularly in that area, you go and get a coffee at Starbucks and you have, soy milk, almond milk, and it goes on and on and on, and feel like I'm holding people up by asking questions. But so here's the, I think I mentioned the best before dates. There's lots of things they do to try to protect the consumer. Here's something most people don't know. Best before dates are voluntary. They are just suggestions by the government. And that's it. So they don't have to provide them. And in many cases, they're a little bit of a guess. The industry, particularly if you've gotten meat in a package from a grocery store, let's say chicken breast or something like that. Sometimes it's a guess in terms of where that best before date is. I've definitely had things go before the best before date, particularly in the meat category and whatnot, and all that. You may think of expiration dates. That's actually a different thing that is legislated, and expiration dates go with certain products. For example, drugs. Drugs all have strict expiration dates, and they're supposed to base that on science, although it's not always. Sometimes they don't have the data on it. Infant formula has to have an expiration date, and a few other things. But foods, it's a best before, and it's more of a best guess, and it's more of a suggestion that you have it on your product. But most products have them nowadays because they're trying to give that information to the consumer and to the grocery store, of course, right, to when to take it off the shelf. So like I said, there's lots of protections. I'm seeing a lot more products have these lift and peel things on there. If you want to know something entirely horrifying, look into the history as to why these lift and peel things happen. Just Google Tylenol murders. It's something you don't know anything about, but it's why we have these things now. But anyway, not going to get into that. It's just one of those horrifying things I learned about maybe only a year ago now, and it's terrible. But yeah, okay. I'm not going to go through all these definitions here. So here's what we really want to know. What can we do to protect our food? All right. So all the recommendations in the home usually hit these 4 categories, right? So chill, clean, separate, and cook. So chill, what does that mean? Most bacteria thrive in warmer temperatures. So room temperature, generally anything about 5 degrees or warmer. So most fridges are around 4 degrees, by the way, just so you know, or 0 to 4 degrees kind of category. And so if your fridge is kind of on the warm end, 6 degrees, 7 degrees, the risk gets a little bit higher. And again, it's going to depend on the product. Mayonnaise, for example, apparently lasts forever. Lunch meats are not going to last forever. So part of it is knowing your foods, right? In terms of what is going to spoil sooner. Pepperoni somewhere in the middle, right? It's got lots of spices and is cured with salts and things like that. So chilling things is good. Number 2, clean things, right? Hopefully it makes sense. People at restaurants have to wash their hands before they prepare your food. It might be a good idea that you do the same in your own house, right? You don't know what's on your hands, whether you've touched the doorknob that somebody had norovirus on, or whether you just went to the washroom recently or whatnot, but all those kind of things are good. But also cleaning surfaces and cleaning foods can be a good idea as well in some cases. It kind of depends on the food and what is exactly recommended. I notice now we're getting to, I'm seeing lots of recommendations that people do not clean their turkeys at Thanksgiving now. And the reason is because it's really hard to clean a turkey and it's messy and you're spraying water all over and it's getting all over the kitchen counter and now you're spreading salmonella everywhere. The big thing to do is just make sure you cook the turkey sufficiently, right? So you can get a thermometer or something like that to make sure that that's done. Number 3, separate. So going back to the turkey or the raw chicken, right? Don't use a cutting board and cut up your raw chicken and then cut up your vegetables on it, right? That's what we want to do. We want to separate things. A lot of contaminations, particularly with certain types of bacteria, are associated with meat products. So you don't want to be associating your raw meat products with things that you're not going to cook, right? Let's say raw vegetables for a salad or something like that. And that's what that separate thing is all about. And that also, if one thing's contaminated, it's not going to get into something else. And the last one is cook things properly. Depending on the food, the temperature you want to cook it to might be different. But generally, for most things, minimum of 60 degrees Celsius is what you want to cook your food at. And for a minimum of certain amount of time, depending on how thick the thing is. And we're talking about core temperatures, which is why cooking thermometers are recommended for some things. And keep your hot foods hot, right? Don't just cook your chicken fingers and then let them sit on your countertop for 2 days and then eat them, right? So I'm convinced that's what they did when I was a student in residence. So I never touched those chicken fingers. I had no idea how long they were sitting there. They just look kind of nasty. Refrigerated foods. Again, it's a little bit about knowing your foods, right? How long things are good for. Maybe the biggest risk is raw meats. There is a best before date on your raw meat, but don't let it sit in there in your fridge for 2 weeks, even if the best before date says that. Throw it in the freezer or cook it. That's the number one risk, I would say, is people leaving raw meats too long. Now, again, if you're cooking it, I don't know. I mean, there's some debate around that kind of thing. I know I have definitely had raw chicken that I pulled out of the package. And, sometimes you give that sniff and you're like, do I cook it or not? Right. I mean, sometimes it's definitely a no, but there's always that area in the middle. So again, cooking food is the second piece of protection. You can see there's other things in there, right? Eggs and bacon and all those kind of things. Kind of depends on whether the package is opened or not, because once you've exposed things to air, there's also more potential for contamination and also food oxidation as well. And you can see mayonnaise is on there, and all I know is I've heard mayonnaise apparently lasts forever. I don't know. I don't eat mayonnaise. So there's something else about me. Proper hand washing, right? I'm not going to go through all the steps of proper hand washing, but there's a couple of things I'd like to say about it. And it's the kind of thing that, you can see, for example, on here, right? It's talking about 15 to 20 seconds, right? How many times you see people wash their hands and it's like less than a second, right? Anytime that you think you have stuff on you, wash your hands. The other thing you can see is noticed on here is notice they're turning the tap off with their towel or paper towel. And that's another one, you can do when you're in a public area or even in your own kitchen, particularly if you're washing something and you're, you don't know what's on that handle, right? You used your dirty hands to turn on the handle, and now you're touching your clean hands to that dirty handle, right? So, just something to think about. But anyway, proper hand washing, always a good idea. I was hoping to do this. We ran out of plates and do a little test, get some people to put their hands on some Petri plates, but you can see that, when you do this kind of thing, and we can incubate the plates, you can see how much bacteria grow relatively quickly over day. And so you can see this is from the textbook, and you can see somebody put their hand on the plates, and the next day, that's kind of an interesting one. I never see those red ones, but so I don't know what was on her hand there. But anyway, it's there's just bacteria everywhere. So meat thermometers, you're starting to see these advertised a lot more. The whole idea here is to, and you can actually, you're seeing a lot of chefs use them a lot more often in terms of barbecuing and whatnot. And the idea is to get your internal temperature of your food to a certain degree. And there's all sorts of different thermometers, some for barbecuing, some for in the oven. There's fridge thermometers. I've never actually tested my fridge. Like I said, the sniff test is usually good enough, I would say in most cases, but some people are paranoid about their fridge being the right temperature and things like that. And there's a lot of recommendations out there. And usually, what I recommend people do is when you buy a thermometer, buy one that actually has the temperatures printed on the thermometer. Then you don't have to Google them every time. Because the big thing is chicken versus beef versus hamburgers, they all have different numbers. And some people think in Fahrenheit and some people think in Celsius, and it gets pretty confusing. So if you buy a thermometer that has it printed on the thermometer, you're in good shape, right? The digital ones are best by far. I've had a few of these at home. Get the digital one. A few extra bucks is not going to hurt. The non-digital ones really suck and they're a pain in the butt, and you're burning your hands to try to get them in there. The digital ones are almost instant, right? So get a digital one. What else were we going to say? I guess we talked about this already in terms of what foods are the highest risks. So a lot of animal products that are uncooked, right? Those are high risk products because, of course, bacteria love to grow and thrive on these things. And so cooking them is kind of the number one thing we can do to protect ourselves, or having products that are already pre-protected, such as pasteurized milk, for example, is another way to do it. Raw produce, in some cases, can be a risk. And more sometimes that's on two ends. Either it's contaminated at the source, as I mentioned, certain farming situations, or in some cases, people are not doing the right thing around their kitchen, right? So, you can have all your produce in one crisper and don't put your lunch meat in the same crisper, right? Separate things. Remember, that's one of the principles, keep things separated out. Don't cut your produce on the cutting board that you just used for your raw meat. I know some people that go on the other end where they're super panicky about this and they have separate cutting boards for their meat and their vegetables. I don't know if that's necessary or not, but it is a reasonable precaution.
Can you cut the same type of vegetable on the same cutting board?
Well, the vegetables are not usually the risk of things that are contaminated. You're worried about the stuff on the meat contaminating the vegetables, right?
Okay.
So, you can cut all your cucumbers and carrots all on one, vegetable cutting board and, that kind of thing, right? But sometimes there's risk with certain types of produce. Like I said, the sprouts are the one that if there's any one sprout or any one vegetable cut out of your diet because of contamination, that's the one, because they grow over bacteria, and so you can wash them and it's doing nothing, right? It's still in there. I know, I don't even eat sprouts. Once in a while I put them on, you go to Subway and you put them on. It's just like, I'd just rather have something else. I don't know. Maybe they're good for you, but I just, cucumbers are so much better. Yeah. Honey, we mentioned as well, right? But yeah, I have a friend who grows his own, so I don't know what he does with that. It's probably all organic and everything. Yeah, I love all this data here, and you can see this one here. Notice the title, right? Fruits and vegetables poison more Americans than beef and chicken. There's definitely the thought that animal products are bad, and they certainly can be, but generally we are cooking them, right? Whereas vegetables, we may not necessarily be doing so. And if contamination happens, people can get sick. Bunch of different suggestions about what you could do, clean them and wash them and those kind of things, right? And here's where you're getting to the area of opinions on what you should wash and what you shouldn't wash and how exactly you should do it. It's not a bad idea if you're concerned about pesticides and whatnot. And we'll talk about pesticides. Don't know if we'll get there today or not. You know, and there's recipes and there's like solutions you can buy in the grocery stores. But the number one thing you can do and to get rid of a kind of like, I don't know, 75% of contaminants is running cold water on something. That will get rid of 75% of all contaminants. So at a minimum, not a bad idea. Again, opinions on what you should do. And I know there's different ways to wash things and nobody likes wet lettuce, right? So you can get those lettuce things. I don't know what they're called, you know.
Salad spinners.
Sure. Yeah. Remember my mom doing it and it was lots of fun. Anyway, yeah, so there's lots of things you can do with these things. And like I said, lots of opinions there on that, but there's some suggestions from the textbook. Okay, a few other things we want to talk about in this topic. And like I said, there's a lot of things we could get into in a lot of detail, but I'm going to just cover a few certain things. One is food irradiation. And this is something that I find is super curious because it is maybe one of the safest things we could possibly do to food. And the amount of misinformation and fear on the internet, right, about food irradiation. So I will say this right off the top. This will not make your food radioactive. Okay? That is, I've seen that on the internet. It does not make your food radioactive. What you're doing is you're hitting food with ionizing radiation. So basically something similar to X-rays, right? So when you get an X-ray at the dentist or wherever, you don't come home radioactive. Okay? You are hit by radioactive rays for a short amount of time, right? So the dentist, it's like half a second or whatever. And it's basically the same thing going on with the food. Now it's actually stronger than X-rays. It's higher energy because what you're trying to do is not take an X-ray, but what you're trying to do is damage the DNA of the microorganisms that may be on the food. So you can see this example here. There's some strawberries there, irradiated versus non-irradiated food. So you're damaging DNA. That's all you're doing. But then once the radiation is turned off, it's not coming to the consumer radioactive. It just means the pathogens and I guess the DNA in the fruit is damaged, and now they can't grow and they can't make you sick, right? Because they can't, you know, they're not necessarily dead, but they can't reproduce, let's say, right? It's kind of like sterilizing them, I guess. So this is becoming a little bit more widespread. Canada was one of the slow adopters for this kind of thing, but now we have a few products, and every time I check the list, 1 or 2 new products are added to this list. So in Canada, we only have a very limited list of products that are approved for food irradiation. And you can see onions, potatoes, whole wheat flour, whole and ground spices, dehydrated seasonings, raw and frozen ground beef. I have no idea why those certain things are on the list. I have no idea. I can say, though, that ground beef is kind of one of the higher risk things that might have pathogens in it, right? Because you're not just grinding the meat, but you're mixing things into it, and you're, you know, the chances for contamination are a little bit higher. The good news is I think most of us probably cook our ground beef, but there are recipes that don't, right? Anyone ever have steak tartare? Anyone know what I'm talking about? No one knows what I'm talking about. You do?
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't know it was raw though.
Yeah, it's basically raw ground beef and there's spices or something put in there. And my brother-in-law had it and he says it's delicious, but he'll eat anything. So I'm not taking his, you know, I'm not going to try it yet. But that's basically what it is. And that's an area that's pretty popular apparently in France. So anyway, so there's higher risk of certain illnesses in France due to that exact practice. Yeah. So if you ever see this logo on the food, I don't know whether they're required to put it on there or not. I know in the States they are, in Canada I'm not entirely sure, but it means that the food has been irradiated. So we could get into a list of about 1,000 things that could be in your foods. And like I said, I'm not going to get into everything here. One thing to mention is some foods have natural toxins in them, right? Actually, probably all foods do to some degree. Pears, I can't remember the toxin in it. There's something in the skin that if you ate something like the equivalent of 100 pears in one day, you would die. Nobody usually does that. Potatoes, certain varieties have something in their skin more than other varieties. Cucumbers, same thing. I mean, there's a huge list. You can look up some of these here. Red tide toxin is more associated with shellfish and that have associated with algal blooms and so on. I'm not going to go through all of those. Some of them I know a little bit about. Many of them I know very little about. There's heavy metals that can concentrate in certain foods. Mercury is one that we talk about that can concentrate in seafood sometimes and whatnot. And mercury, of course, is quite toxic. It can affect your nervous system. Like I said, I'm not going to get into all of these in a whole bunch of details. I want to talk a little bit about pesticides. One of the most famous ones of all time is DDT, which was banned many years before I think all of us here were born, and is definitely in your blood. Kind of scary, isn't it? DDT is in your blood, for sure. It's still in the ecosystem. PCBs are another one. You can look them up, probably also in your blood, have been phased out for a number of years now. They're kind of one of those persistent toxic organics. And the good news is the values are going down. But it's worth it to talk about kind of pesticides in general. Growth hormones and antibiotics, I'm not going to get into those into a lot of detail either. Those are things that were previously used in Canada and are either not necessarily completely banned, but in terms of where they're at, the values have gone right down. You can't. You used to be able to give antibiotics to animals in their feed like all the time, anytime you wanted, for example. Right now, you can only give it to the animal when it's sick. Kind of makes sense, but turns out giving it to the animals in the feed actually made them grow faster. So why not do it? Well, superbugs and things like that. And same thing with growth hormones. There are reasons why you'd give an animal growth hormones, but routine use of them is pretty much banned in Canada now. So we're not going to get into all of those things. Oh, there we go. So let's talk a little bit about pesticides and a couple other things. So some of these things it's worth it to know can concentrate up in the biosystem. So we call this bioaccumulations. And so generally you can see what's going on in this diagram here is you have, I don't know, let's say it's DDT, right? And it gets into the microorganisms that, the plankton that's eaten by the fish, the small fish are eaten by the bigger fish, and then the bigger fish are eaten by another bigger fish, and it all bioaccumulates. And so when the human eats that fish, they're getting a whole bunch of DDT or mercury or something like that. And so, this is something that we're concerned about. And this is why over the past 100 years, certain things have been banned and our use around them has changed, like mercury and DDT and those kind of things. And this is the kind of thing that we do try to monitor when new products come on the market. And every product kind of has a different thing around it, pesticides and chemicals and things like that. And the problem is just with humans in general, right? How many new chemicals end up on the market annually? I have no idea. 10,000, 100,000. How do you keep up with that in the research? It's very hard to do. But this is the kind of thing we're concerned about the most with a lot of these things, right? Is the bioaccumulation. And some of these things have upper limits and whatnot on them. And like I said, different areas of legislation. So if you're concerned about bioaccumulation, mercury is the big one around seafood. Do not eat fish livers, for example, and just monitor your usage of certain types of fish. The other thing you can do is cut off the fat off of meat. Certain pesticides are fat soluble and they concentrate in the fats. So that's another thing that you can do. How does pesticide end up in food? Well, hopefully that's obvious. Sprayed on the plants or bioaccumulates in the animals and eventually ends up to the consumer, right? Lots of things that could be said about pesticides, right? If you think about something like a banana is a low risk food to eat for pesticides because you usually, I don't know anybody who eats the skin, for example, right? We peel the skin off and then the fruit is on the inside. Whereas other things like apples, maybe you eat the skin, right? So that's a higher risk kind of category and those kind of things. The other thing we can say about pesticides is we cannot judge them all in the same way. There's so much we could say about pesticides. If you are a pesticide advocate, talk to farmers. It's interesting to talk to farmers in terms of around their thoughts around pesticides, and they certainly know a lot more about them, about which ones are toxic and why they're using them. And there's very great economic reasons why we use pesticides. We would not be able to feed the planet with organic farming. That's just where we're at right now. We cannot produce enough food without using pesticides. If you're a farmer, think about all the stress on the farm of hoping that your crop will make it, right? And you're not going to lose 80% of it because of some insect or some weed or something like that. So there's a lot of good reasons to have pesticides. The bad news is some of them are very bad for us. Some of them biodegrade. Some of them are carcinogens. like I said, the store, just as many pesticides they are, each of the one of them has to be judged on their own merit in terms of what they are. Okay, and so that's some things we can say about it. Generally, for things that bioaccumulate, it's the same vulnerable people. Children, elderly. Children are most susceptible to things like toxic organics because they have small bodies, underdeveloped immune systems. They're generally eating more food per pound of body than you are, right? A young child will sometimes eat as much as an adult because they're growing, and so you're eating more food and getting more toxics in you and those kind of things. And their bodies are not are less likely to be able to deal with it. But that's kind of the thing to say about pesticides, right? Like I said, is do not judge them all as the same. Some of them are really, really nasty chemicals, and they've been banned for good reasons, and they're controversial for very good reasons. And others are kind of in this ether of, are they bad or are they not? And then others are, people don't blame them so much, right? Notice I'm not telling you that synthetic pesticides are worse than natural pesticides. That's not necessarily the case. There are lots of natural pesticides, natural products that are nastier than synthetic human-made ones, right? So that's something that we can say for sure. Every chemical has to be judged on its own merit. Next day, I'm going to talk a little bit more about organic foods. I know that's a big trend and multi-billion-dollar industry, and we'll talk about those a little bit here next day. I think that's about where I wanted to finish. Maybe I'll finish here. Like I said, there's lots of products you can get in the store, lots of recipes on the internet. The recipes, the ones I've seen, are contradictory. The big one I see is, rinse your vegetables in a little bit of baking soda and water, but then the other one is saying rinse your vegetables in vinegar and water. So that's contradictory because one of them is vinegar and water is going to give you an acidic, and baking soda and water is going to give you an alkaline. So I don't know what's going to work. Wash them, right? Cold water, 75, 80%, it's going to get rid of most of your contaminants. Everything else, I don't know where the food science is on it, but you can look into them if that's something that you're interested in and dealing with them. And here's some suggestions from some infographic I found on the internet. So I'll finish there. More on organic foods on Friday, and we'll see you then. Thanks for coming out.